talk, we'll have a few minutes for a formal Q&A, but then at 5:30-ish, we invite you to join us at Nick's on the second floor to continue our conversation with Dr. Dyer in a less formal setting. On behalf of the Colloquium Committee, Dr. Pravina Shukla, Kimberly Watson, and Olivia Phillips, we wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University, Bloomington, is built on indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Now, every time I give this land acknowledgement, I also tell myself that to make it less than just a performative act, I like to share the work of one of our colleagues in ethnomusicology, Renata Yazzie, who is the founder and director of the American Indian Musician Scholarship. So every time I do read this land acknowledgement, I do donate $20. And I invite, and you are more than welcome to reject my invitation, that you do the same. You don't have to do 20, you can do less, you can do more. But I invite everyone to support this very important scholarship. Now to our guest speaker. Jeffrey Dyer holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from Boston University and is currently a visiting assistant professor of ethnomusicology here at IU's Department of Folklore Ethnomusicology. After finishing his BA at Hamilton College, Jeff conducted research in Southeast Asia for the first time on a Watson Fellowship. Since that first visit, he has learned to play 3 Cambodian musical instruments. For 7 years, Dr. Dyer taught English and humanities subjects at Boston Public Middle and high schools, but his commitment to pedagogy also took him outside the traditional classroom to work in wilderness-based experiential education settings, to teach teenagers and adults the arts of backpacking and canoeing. He developed an international travel program through which he led high school students from Arizona on 2 educational trips to Southeast Asia. While working in secondary education, Dr. Dyer also devoted himself to public ethnomusicology, working with numerous Cambodian American musicians and dancers in the Northeast, in the Washington, D.C. area, and Chicago. Additionally, he organized and managed a month-long performance tour in the United States for Cambodian musicians. Dr. Dyer has received various fellowships and awards, including the Best Student Paper Prize on Asian Music presented at the Society for Ethnomusicology's conference. And I say that to remind those of you who are headed that way in a couple of weeks that you may also be eligible as students currently in this program. You can also find some of Dr. Dyer's work in scholarly journals, such as Ethnomusicology, Yale Journal of Music and Religion, and Asian Musics. At this time, won't you please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Jeffrey Dyer.
Thank you, Fernando, for the introduction, and also thank you for all the work you do behind the scenes to make this talk and the whole series possible. It's much, much appreciated. Also want to thank you all for coming here today. Life is busy. The semester, every semester is too busy, so I appreciate you taking the time, making the time to be here. I'll just say a few introductory words about this material that I'm going to share, and then I'll jump into it. I do apologize. I did the kind of conference presentation thing and printed out the talk, but hopefully at the end we can get into some more discussion on this. So what I'm going to share today is a condensed version of the last chapter, the final chapter of my dissertation. And I chose this material specifically because I wanted to see if it could kind of stand on its own without being kind of embedded at the end of a larger project. And since a number of you here, I think, don't know the larger project, this seemed like a good test case to see if this material stands on its own. So thank you for being test subjects here. So I share this really with an eye toward revision. So I welcome all your criticism, suggestions, feedback, with an eye to making this better. The only other, I think, contextual thing that I'll say is that the way this material kind of wrote itself out, I ended up being less invested in music as an object of study than I am in other parts of the project. So hopefully that's not too disappointing. There's a little bit of music in here, but we can talk about how music applies to the broader project if you want. But let's begin. In December 2018, Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen presided over the 3-day Win Win ceremony that he initiated. The event inaugurated the Win Win Monument, a nearly 200-foot tall structure that Hun Sen had commissioned. Both the ceremony and the monument commemorated the 20th anniversary of the Win Win policy, the compromise that Hun Sen brokered in 1998 to finalize peace with the notorious and violent Khmer Rouge regime. The few years that preceded this win-win ceremony had been far from peaceful. Following the national elections in 2013, Hun Sen claimed victory despite widespread allegations of election abuses and voter intimidation. Large protests broke out in Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital, voicing support for the opposition party, but military police used deadly violence to effectively silence the protests. Events over the next few years evinced a clear trajectory from 2013's groundswell of public outcry and grassroots action to authoritarian rule. The government closed independent media outlets, jailed the opposition party's leader, and through the Supreme Court, they dissolved the opposition party. Without any viable alternative, Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party won the 2018 national election in a landslide. 5 months to the day after that election, Hun Sen presided over the win-win ceremony. Over the ceremony's 3 days, commentary on the Prime Minister's strong-armed governance was either silenced or omitted, while the spectacle's various events voiced a unified national history. Dignitaries' speeches, including one by Hun Sen, cast the Prime Minister as the central protagonist of Cambodian history, who secured peace and prosperity for his country. The Win-Win Monument itself echoed the historiography of Cambodia's ancient Angkor era, with bas-reliefs documenting scenes of war and the redevelopment that Hun Sen had overseen. The festivities culminated with a theatrical performance entitled The History of the Cambodian Nation. Actors depicted the broad scope of Cambodia's past, portraying many eras from the ancient kingdoms through the current moment of Hun Sen's government. The show's conclusion featured a pop song describing Hun Sen's negotiations with the Khmer Rouge, while performers waved national flags and actors chanted victory to the win-win politicians. Since the very moment of their deaths, the people who died while the Khmer Rouge were in power have, to paraphrase Catherine Verdery, they have led particularly active political lives. This talk traces how different factions have approached those dead and past violence through divergent registers of voice, different sonorities, and disparate modes of being historical. I focus on 3 sets of practices. First, commemorative performances and rituals sponsored by the Cambodian government and Cambodian politicians, such as the Win-Win ceremony. Theater performances initiated by foreign activists who aim to facilitate healing by giving voice to past traumas. And third, Cambodians' ritual and storytelling practices by which they care for the living and the dead. By examining how those practices and their disparate political aims intersect, I unpack the many tensions, convergences, multiple histories, and ethical predicaments that can mark a post-war or post-genocide society. In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge took control of Phnom Penh, bringing closure to an 8-year civil war. Under the leadership of Pol Pot, the regime worked over the next 4 years to revolutionize Cambodia into an agrarian utopia. They emptied people from the cities and forced them to live in rural collectives and work long hours of manual labor. They attempted to return Cambodia to what they took to be its authentic roots, its authentic past, by abolishing schools, doing away with religion, and doing away with all modern influences. Many people died from overwork and starvation, and through detention or re-education centers, cadres worked to identify and eliminate their enemies, who included Cambodians who had embraced Western modernity or did not display enough revolutionary zeal. They deposited the dead in mass graves that were eventually known as the killing fields. Estimates range widely, but anywhere from 1.7 million to 3.5 million people died during the 3 years, 8 months, 22 days that the Khmer Rouge were in power. In early 1979, the Vietnamese army ousted the Khmer Rouge and ushered in a new government, but the Khmer Rouge began a new civil war, and some factions remained active until 1998's win-win policy. Since the Khmer Rouge's ouster, the words silence and voice have circulated widely in Cambodia in reference to how past violence reverberates in the present. As several scholars discuss, silence can indicate trauma, repressed memories, and political suppression, whereas voice involves healing, legal justice, and political action. Building on these authors, I link those prominent English language metaphors of silence and voice with liberal conceptions of modern subjectivity and political agency. And I show how they operate in Cambodia in conjunction with common notions in trauma studies of pathology and healing. At the same time, I discuss how silence's meaning can be indeterminate and how the meaning of voice can also be murky, to the point that silence and voice's metaphors can seep into each other, which becomes even more pronounced when considering Cambodian notions of silence as generating equanimity and being an effective way to relate with others. Some Cambodians have embraced liberal notions of silence, voice, agency, and healing, but others have rejected them or merged them with local religious, artistic, and remembrance practices. A point I emphasize in this talk is that crossing between divergent notions of silence and voice entails crossing between different political philosophies, models of history, modes of personhood, and ontologies. On one hand, I illustrate how Cambodians, their politicians, and Western NGOs are speaking past each other through divergent concepts of silence and voice. Putting this phenomenon of speaking past each other into dialogue with recent critiques of trauma studies, understandings of voice, agency, and healing, I detail how disparate practices of remembrance, history, and voice can involve incommensurate modes of well-being, sociality, collectivity, and political action. On the other hand, I ultimately describe a surprising convergence in which non-Cambodians' humanitarian activism calling for speech about the genocide ends up supporting Hun Sen's authoritarian aims. My argument is that an overabundance of public performance and testimonial speech has far from helping Cambodians, it has become a haunting presence that plagues Cambodians through an unceasing recurrence. Many Cambodians have responded by gravitating toward a mode of vocal restraint that I term intimate voice, speaking and acting in quiet and guarded ways that only close relations can hear, foregrounding sound and performance as ways people cope with the violent past. I ethnographically examine how crossing between divergent ontologies, political philosophies, and ways of living with history can lead to ethical quandaries with no obvious resolution. Part 1. One morning in May 2019, I joined the musician and dancer Sangsray Bek at a coffee shop in Siem Reap, Cambodia. I had gone back to Siem Reap to observe the arts troupe Far rehearse See You Yesterday, a performance about the Khmer Rouge era. This performance was initiated by Global Arts Corps, a New York-based theater collective whose director Michael Lessig writes that in Cambodia, quote, "Personal experiences of violence, privation, and loss remain unspoken." He says the show will, quote, "break this legacy of silence by using theatrical arts to foster perceptual change, dialogue, and understanding." The rehearsal was in the afternoon, and since Sang Sore Pik also had the morning free, we took the opportunity to catch up. Sang plays the same Cambodian instrument that I do, and we talked about how her lessons were going. She then asked what brought me back to Siem Reap. I told her about CU yesterday, explaining its premise of giving voice to the Khmer Rouge past. She replied, "But they do so many shows about the Khmer Rouge. Everyone does that. What about the other eras?" Sang then launched into a history lesson, listing people and events covering several centuries, which she said would make for compelling theater about Cambodia if foreigners or anyone cared to make those productions. Her interest in a diversity of topics stretched across chronological time differs from the performances that non-Cambodians have created about Cambodia, which fixate on a single moment, the most violent moment of Cambodia's recent past. That approach to history, the non-Cambodians one through the performances, it aligns with common approaches to trauma. In the prevailing biomedical model, trauma, or PTSD, is a person's biological response to an overwhelming event. When people cannot process an experience as it occurs, intrusive memories return and people will suffer in asocial silence until they can distance themselves from debilitating memories and reconstitute subjectivity through the curative powers of testimony and narrative reconstruction. The terms silence and voice are crucial here, with silence indicating trauma and voice being both the means of reconstituting a healthy subject through narration and a metaphor for subjectivity itself. I want to be clear that my intention is not to deconstruct this notion of trauma. Many people, from war veterans to survivors of rape and genocide, have experienced these symptoms and have benefited from talk therapy and testimony. What Cambodians' practices do lead me to question is the assumption that this response to a horrible life experience is entirely biological, meaning that trauma's etiology and treatment are universally applicable. The assumption that trauma is universal has driven the work of humanitarian organizations in post-war contexts, such as Cambodia, where aid workers often assume people suffer from trauma and need to speak out. For instance, beginning in the mid-1990s, aid workers in Cambodia observed what they termed a traumatized culture of silence. And since then, foreign activists have been urging Cambodians to speak out in order to heal. Numerous anthropologists and psychiatrists have critiqued these types of humanitarian programs, though few of them have focused on Cambodia. For my purposes, the one key point that this scholarship makes is that the difficulty that humanitarian programs seek to address, those difficulties quickly augment in scale from a personal problem to a national condition, and that the cure for both is predicated on liberal models of justice and voice. As Carol Kidron, an anthropologist, aptly summarizes, quote, "Whether the issue is personal, communal, or national silence, well-being is thought to be contingent on the liberation of voice." This trauma paradigm pervades CU yesterday. Actors depict scenes of suffering, they narrate loss and violence to reconstruct a narrative of troubling events, or, as the show's promotional material claims, they are, quote, "shattering the silence of history with each breath." However, as Sang Sore Pik correctly observed, this performance is one of many to make this claim. Here are just a few of the many, many performances organized by non-Cambodians about the Khmer Rouge. This performance genre is itself one kind of node in a broad discursive field, stretching from development projects to journalists to academic writing. And all of these take silence as pathological and discourse itself to initiate healing and justice for Cambodians. However, these calls to break a silence did not do much for Sang Sore Pik. That morning at the coffee shop, she told me, quote, "My mom said you should have been in the Pol Pot time. You would have known what happened. I said to my mom, "I don't want to know." As our conversation went on, I asked her why. Because I think that I didn't live through that difficult experience, and I don't want to know about that story of suffering, because I think that people of that era were really stupid. But if you make me watch that, I don't want to watch that. Song is clearly knowledgeable about the Khmer Rouge, terming them stupid, brainless, and having caused much suffering. And as our conversation went on, she indicated that she might be interested in learning more about them. She said, "Okay, I want to know about that era too, but I don't want them to spread it widely, just talking about it everywhere and all of the time. They have no new ideas. They just take the same ideas about that era, the same thing over and over again." Another musician, Nyok Sok Hang, he offered a similar perspective. "As for me," he said, "I am not interested in those performances at all. First, they might seem to bring in benefits, so I don't entirely reject them, but they bring in politics much more. We already know that the Khmer Rouge era was a time of genocide on our own people, but it's not necessary to demonstrate all of that." For them, it seems that one problem about these performances is how they distort Cambodian history, heightening and magnifying the importance of a single era through continual repetition. Several of anthropologist Carol Kidron's Cambodian-Canadian interlocutors articulated very similar concerns, with one stating, quote, "We accept the past and deal with the present. The genocide is over. We look toward the future. It was just one event and not even a major one," end quote. This approach to history, and the one Sangsarepik promoted by saying they should do shows about different eras, it dilutes the importance of a violent period by contextualizing it in the broad sweep of Cambodia's past. Anthropologists Anya Bernstein and Catherine Verdery have noted similar historicizing practices in other post-socialist contexts, emphasizing how people would edit out the socialist period or lengthen a timeline to treat those eras as brief aberrations. Still, Sangsarepik indicated that she understands why some people do want to create performances about the Khmer Rouge. I think that the people who make those shows about the Pol Pot time, they want it to never come back. Or they want Cambodians or foreigners to know that Cambodia had wars. But sometimes, this is just for me, I don't remember the reason why the war started, because Cambodians killed Cambodians. Those shows don't make people remember about that. If they seriously did, if you seriously want people to know about that time, they should recall the reasons why it happened. Like many Cambodians, Sangsarepik is familiar with the mantra of never again, that since the Jewish Holocaust has fueled war and genocide commemorations around the world. However, she questions that paradigm's foundation, the performative alchemy by which never forget transforms into never again. Instead, she says performances about the Khmer Rouge would only be valuable if they detailed the reasons why they happened. Finding foreigners' performances to be silent on that matter, Sang sees little value in reiterating histories of stupidity and suffering. As I discussed throughout this talk, here, in this case, a prominent Western understanding of voice, that it can forestall future violence, it does not align with how Cambodians approach the violent past. Part 2. During one of our conversations, the Cambodian singer Dara Sang told me that whenever her mother eats a meal, she whispers to her ancestors and leaves a small amount of food for them. This practice is relatively common. I've seen Cambodians of all ages set aside some meat, fish, or rice, and then whisper a quiet invitation to their ancestors. For Dara Sang's mother, this practice held additional significance. That's how she survived the Khmer Rouge, Sang continued. You know, they didn't give you a lot of food at that time, but every time she ate, she gave something for them. That's one reason why she survived. Numerous scholars have concluded that due to Cambodians' silence about the Khmer Rouge, their children lack knowledge about those years, and because of that, they have inherited the trauma that plagues their parents. However, just like Sangsaripik, Dorasam, she clearly knows much about her mother's experiences. I was curious about the contexts in which Sam and her mother spoke, and I asked if her mother ever offered public testimony or spoke with NGOs about her experiences. She replied without hesitation, "My mother doesn't talk with them, she talks with me." With my question, I invoked a widespread formulation that links notions of personhood, agency, and civic action with the concept of voice. Amanda Weidman writes that public speaking's association with, quote, personal agency and political power is among the most common and naturalized meanings that voice has in English, and by extension, the Euro-Western context. Voice is central to political action in representative democracies. Citizens speak through their votes, and representatives speak for their constituents. But voice can also be a mode of resistance, as people like Spivak or James Scott have argued, as in the practice of speaking back to larger structures of power. Ethnomusicologists have critiqued this prevalent framework by moving beyond an exclusive focus on voice as signification. Lila Ellen Gray demonstrates how the voice's sonic and material qualities are crucial to affect and sociality. Benjamin Tausig discusses how discursive and non-discursive sounds communicate dissent, and Marie Abe, Laura Convictor, and Kay Kaufman-Chalamet all relate how silence resonates as both political oppression and resistance. These ethnomusicologists have greatly expanded our notion of how people speak by attending to different vocal registers and modes of sonic enactment. But for the most part, they assume that people want to speak out, that people want to have their voice heard and voice dissent within a large social collective. The point that I want to underscore is that by prioritizing people's attempts to speak and sound out in a broad public, much work by these ethnomusicologists and several others who have admirable progressive aims, it remains within the liberal paradigm linking public voice with political agency. But Durasam's statement, "My mother doesn't talk with them, she talks with me," it broaches a different configuration of silence and voice, agency and politics, by inverting the hierarchy that places public agential speech above all other modalities of voice. By declining to participate in that liberal paradigm, Sam indicated that for her and her mother, voice is to be quiet, guarded, and reserved for intimate contexts and concerns when only a few close associates can hear. I term that quiet mode of speech intimate voice, and I refer to the close-knit social relations that it can bring about as intimate sociality. Sam and her mother's intimate voices invoke some sense of the word silence, but they do not refuse to speak or disavow voice. Rather, they purposely prioritize a voice that reverberates intimately. It is with the intimate voices of murmurs and whispers that Cambodians make offerings to ancestors, who then provide protection and care in return by oftentimes conjoining with people's bodies and their very beings. Through an intimate voice addressed to one's closest relations, a mother can tell her daughter how she survived. Intimacy here does not equal privacy, which in liberal formulations is often opposed to public. Like sound and silence, the opposition of public from private has been taken to be universal, and through scholars like Hannah Arendt and Michael Warner has been shown to be rather illusory, with the two intermingling more than people often realize. Still, as Jim Sykes discusses, some governments enforce a strict division between a secular public and a religious private. And as Michael Birnbaum-Quintero points out, sound studies embeds the public-private division in its formulation of the idealized listener as an autonomous individual seeking refuge from an unruly oral public through private property and individuated listening. Dorasam and her mother, they do retreat from public discourse, but they do not seek a private refuge. In fact, when subjectivity entails a sociality within, to invoke Marilyn Strathern, as it does when the living and dead are ontologically entwined, then the notion of a private realm set off from the public becomes nonsensical. Instead, Dorasam and her mother used an intimate voice to enact sociality on a smaller scale. Their intimate voices are social and relational, engaging each other, deities, and the dead, without being public in the Western liberal sense. Intimate voice generates a social collective with a short radius. Examples of people using an intimate voice to grapple with the Khmer Rouge's legacy occurred frequently during my fieldwork. What I'm going to do now is to detail two different iterations of an intimate voice. The first are people's stories they told about food, and the second is our ritual practices that, in this case, involve music, dance, and spirit possession. In March 2019, I traveled to Sri Lanka with Cambodian musicians and dancers who were hired to consecrate the island's first Cambodian Buddhist monastery. On a day off from the consecration ritual, we visited the Kalaniya Raja Maha Temple near Colombo. By the temple's entrance, volunteers handed out bags of fruit and nuts that can be used as offerings. Later, as we drove away from the temple, the dance troupe's teacher explained to her students in the van the significance of that the lotus fruits had for her. In Pol Pot's time, we took that to make medicine, she said. She demonstrated how they would peel back the outer layers to reveal this green medicinal center. She added, the Khmer Rouge had medicine, but they didn't give it to us. So we took this medicine. It helped only a little bit, but it did help. Mon Main, a retired musician who lounges in many, many hammocks. He lives in a small village outside Siem Reap. He often shared similar stories with his relatives and his children about his Khmer Rouge experiences. One evening I hung out with him and his wife at their house as dusk accumulated and the sounds of frogs began to fill the night. He asked me if the frogs in America are large. I answered. And then he said that he ate frogs when the Khmer Rouge were in power. We caught them and ate them, he said. There wasn't much else to eat. We caught and ate them. We caught other things from nature, too. He concluded, Cambodians have suffered much. Another time I was at a ritual with Mon Main and with him and his children when it was the banana leaves that were used in the ceremony inspired another brief set of comments. We ate banana leaves during the war era, Mon Main said. Under Pol Pot, they didn't let you eat, didn't let you play music, didn't let you stay in your own village. Oops. For Ngam Ratanak, a musician in his early 30s, it was banana nuts, not banana leaves, that reminded him of his mother's stories about her life under the Khmer Rouge. When he was a young boy, her mother often described how she found banana nuts to eat by digging them out of the dirt at the base of banana trees. Ngam said that his mother could have been killed if somebody had seen her, but that hunger compelled her to search for food. We were sitting in the shade beside the house of Ngam's music teacher, about 5 kilometers outside the provincial capital of Siem Reap. Along the dirt path that passes in front of this house, there are several mid-sized banana trees. Ngam led me over to one of them, and we dug in the dirt by its base. He echoed the gestures that his mother had made decades earlier, and he uncovered several nuts in short order. As we dug, Ngam's teacher walked over and he asked what we were doing. Ngam said, we were looking for banana nuts. His teacher replied, oh yeah, we ate those during Pol Pot's time. These stories about food, including the one that Dara Sam heard from her mother, were all intimately voiced. They were uttered for children, students, and spouses. They involved hunger, suffering, and the constant threat of violence. But what I heard coming through most powerfully was not necessarily a teleology from violence to trauma, but the remarkable actions that people took to survive, the alternative medicine they found, the uncommon sustenance they scavenged, and the ancestors they fed. Elders shared important life advice and skills for survival. They prepared the next generation to face difficulties, to cope amid suffering, and to care for themselves and others. All of those interventions have political ramifications, beginning with the basic point that amid governmental violence and repression, survival itself is a political act. I take these Cambodians' intimately voiced stories about food then to be quietly enacted modes of political action, ways to mobilize past hardships to help close relations become stronger actors in the world. A different modality of remembrance and intimate voice occurs at the possession rituals conducted every Miak. Miak is the third lunar month, and these rituals renew relations with ancestral spirits and tutelary land beings. The type of music, we finally got to music, briefly. The type of music that's played at these rituals, it changes according to the type of spirits that are involved in each spirit's individual proclivities. At one ritual that I attended, musicians used traditional instruments to play Cambodian rock songs from the 1950s and the 1960s because that was the type of music that particular specific spirit enjoyed to listen to. At another event, a possession ritual in Lovia province of Lovia village of Siem Reap province, musicians played a different type of music. They summoned two dead teachers by playing songs used in the Basak style of Cambodian theater. This village used to host a Basak theater troupe in which many villagers had participated as dancers, singers, musicians. And the ritual called on the troupe's two old teachers, the dance teacher and the music teacher. And these people, since their deaths, they appear now to function as village guardians. The village had hired an ensemble of young professional musicians for this event, but from the very outset, villagers inserted themselves into the proceedings. On the ritual's first song, which was played to summon Tha Poi, the old dance teacher, a villager joined the hired musicians by playing this long cylindrical drum. On the next piece, several women from the village, who in their youth they had learned Tha Poi's choreography, they now sang the song's verses. A few songs later, a middle-aged gentleman who in previous decades he had played music for Tha Poi's dances, he replaced the hired musician playing the large drums. This middle-aged gentleman played with youthful energy, his body shaking up and down as he threw his weight into each drum stroke. Women in the crowd, who in the early 1980s had learned to act, sing, and dance, they now clapped, sang, and swayed along to the lively melodies and the lively rhythms. Many cackled with laughter at the medium's crude dancing, and as the event grew more raucous, several villagers stood up and danced beside their former teacher, who stomped and swayed through the medium. One villager played the pate, that guy over there, which is a two-string zither. Another one replaced the leader of the hired ensemble on the trosao, which is a two-stringed fiddle. It seemed that these village musicians, not the hired ones, they knew the specific rhythms and variations that Tha Poi, the spirit, liked because they had played for him during his human life before he died in the 1960s. Let's listen to a brief clip from that ritual. Song after song after song for several hours, and then they sent Tha Poi, the dance teacher, away. And they summoned Kruso Pot, the troupe's former music teacher. The village musicians continued to play, and they entertained their teacher with songs they had studied from him. Perched on the medium, Kruso Pot danced placidly in front of his students. One of the students rose to dance beside his teacher. Kruso Pot had actually lived a long life. He was 80-something when he passed away. These musicians, who are now middle-aged or older themselves, they had been young boys when they first studied with him. They started a slow, calm melody, and Kruso Pot, through the medium, he sat in front of his students and started to cry. Many in the room also wept, and the medium was still crying when they sent Kruso Pot away. While the villagers and the hired musicians packed up, I struck up a conversation with a woman sitting next to me, and eventually I asked her when Kruso Pot died. During the Pol Pot years, she said. They killed him. No one narrated these teachers' stories to testify to violence or to give voice to the dead because nobody needed to. These dead teachers were there, speaking through themselves, through the medium, with their dances, songs, and tears. In a way, this ritual resembled what Maurice Halbwachs, followed by Pierre Nora and Paul Connerton, described as a lived, embodied, and collective memory embedded in a social milieu. Yet, what had occurred struck me more as a reliving than remembrance, given the way that the English word memory can serve to distance the past. Villagers came face to face with the effects of genocide and the sadness of separation, but they also relived a local history that stretched beyond stories of violence. Many told me that they rekindled the comfort and strength of continued companionship. Through individualized and collective action, carried out on a small scale, villagers clapped and sang, played music and danced, suturing together moments and experiences that sequential time holds apart. I cannot possibly know what everybody felt after encountering these teachers again, but it seems that this ritual, and other rituals like it, as well as those stories about food, they all generated something different than a common interpretation of healing. Those who call for Cambodians to speak out about the Khmer Rouge often presume that a testimonial voice results in healing as catharsis, closure, and a transformative cure. However, through this ritual, villagers reaffirmed relationships with dead teachers, they renewed artistic traditions, they enlivened practices of community, and they provided care and companionship for the dead. Those are all ongoing and open-ended processes, not ones marked by closure or sudden cure. There will come a time when villagers need to conduct this ritual again. These differences from healing may be one reason why, out of all the Cambodian nationals who gave testimony at the Khmer Rouge tribunal, quote, none of them described a catharsis or healing effect, end quote. In one sense, then, I find that this idea of healing is an impoverished or even inaccurate way to conceptualize this ritual's relivings, recallings, sensorial plenitude, relations with the dead, and so much more. It is not healing, but their loved ones' skills and capacities that my interlocutors cultivate when they tell stories of surviving the Khmer Rouge. However, I also find that given the discrepancy between predicted and actual outcomes, the idea of healing sets up a potentially dangerous expectation of sudden and permanent change that may do more harm than good. Part 3. Let's start with another instance of disjuncture and speaking past each other. One night over dinner and not a few beers, I asked the musician Nok Sinat about his take on Bongsikol, a requiem for Cambodia, which is a performance commissioned by the NGO Cambodian Living Arts. They use music, film, and dance to tell a story of survival about the Khmer Rouge. Sorry, I should have kind of underlined the sections that I'm going to quote. I'll quote from their website here. The production aims to be, quote, an essential act of memory, reconciliation, and peace. It aims to provide, quote, a space for healing for those who have suffered violent conflict and forced migration, and honors those who have passed away. My friend, Nok Sinat, he first made sure that I knew the words, the show's title, Bongsikol. It's a Buddhist practice by which Cambodians chant to support the dead, and he made clear that Cambodians have been doing that practice for a very long time. They created a new story and a new event, he said, but it is not different at all from Cambodian traditions. Many people died during the Khmer Rouge time, and so people have been dedicating merit and other materials to them through Bongsikol and by going to the pagoda for a long time. Another one of my music teachers, Gausanon Kavai, who actually played Roniet, his Cambodian xylophone in this production, he offered a similar perspective. When I asked him about the show's remembrance of the dead, he said, we have already done that many times in our own rituals for our own dead and our 7 generations of relatives. Of course, this the show's producers intentionally created this overlap, and that's what makes, I'll go out on a limb, I'd say Bongsikol the most culturally informed production that any foreigner has created or initiated about the Khmer Rouge. But once again, this production's mode of politics did not translate into a Cambodian domain. For these two Cambodians, the essential act of memory, reconciliation, and peace did not register at all, and the production became an act of Buddhist religiosity and sonic efficacy. But as I spoke with more Cambodians about this performance and the slew of others of them like it, I realized that the kind of indifference, the exhaustion, and in some cases the animosity that Cambodians articulated toward these productions, they did not result from a straightforward disjuncture or ontological difference. What I slowly realized is that the problems that these performances posed also stemmed from their resemblance and their conjunction with Cambodia's national politics. To understand how that has played out, we're going to need to go back to Cambodia's post-Khmer Rouge history and the actions of Prime Minister Hun Sen. Almost immediately after the Vietnamese forces drove the Khmer Rouge from power, Cambodia's new government began drawing attention to the regime's atrocities to bolster their own legitimacy both domestically and among the international community that until 1993 continued to support the Khmer Rouge. Cambodian politicians sponsored commemorative performances, they opened dozens of genocide memorials, they developed grade school curriculum, very grisly grade school curriculum about Khmer Rouge violence, and they memorialized mass killings during the annual Day of Maintaining Rage, which is now renamed the National Day of Remembrance. Hun Sen had been part of the Khmer Rouge himself. He defected in 1977, and he became prime minister in 1985. He has held that role ever since. His 37 consecutive years and counting in power, making Hun Sen one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world. At first, Hun Sen continued his predecessor's memorialization practices, but Cambodia's political climate shifted in the 1990s, after the United Nations introduced these international discourses of human rights, reconciliation, and peace. Cambodian politicians began to temper and even silenced Khmer Rouge memorialization because the vitriol that marked those practices was now contrary to the aims of reconciliation and peace. One implication here is that if there was a, quote, culture of silence that aid workers observed back in the 1990s, then it arose, at least in part, from Cambodians' accommodations of transnational rights discourse. However, that respite was brief. Hun Sen now speaks regularly about the Khmer Rouge, using public speeches, memorials, and performances to cast himself as Cambodia's savior from Pol Pot. Moreover, and importantly, he raises the specter of the Khmer Rouge's return and a renewed civil war to justify his authoritarian governance, claiming that he alone can stop future wars from happening. These politics played out at the National Day of Remembrance that I attended at the Chung Ike Killing Fields Memorial. This was in 2019, in a performance reminiscent of the one that concluded the Win-Win ceremony. Actors depicted Khmer Rouge-era suffering and violence, and they chronicled Hun Sen's defection from the Khmer Rouge and his valiant return to liberate Cambodia. After the performance, Buddhist monks and attendees conducted a Bongsikol ritual for the Khmer Rouge-era dead. This is the same ceremony that inspired the NGO Cambodian Living Arts to do their production, Bongsikol, a Requiem for Cambodia. Pictures of that. Bongsikol rites have been paired with this National Day of Remembrance since the 1980s, back when the event was called the Day of Maintaining Rage. In 2019, this line of people who were making dedications to monks who would then chant on behalf of the dead, it stretched under a banner hung over the entranceway. The banner celebrated the political party run by Hun Sen. It reads, "Victory to the Cambodian People's Party." Cambodia's discursive climate may shift again, but at this historical juncture, public offerings to support the genocidal dead, and a performance bearing witness to Khmer Rouge violence, they both operate under a sign promoting Cambodia's powerful and elite. That is the context into which non-Cambodians have unwittingly forayed with their performances about the Khmer Rouge. Within their own discursive and epistemological paradigms, those performances, they enact a gentle voice, they achieve justice, promote survivors' healing, and they forestall future violence. But their efficacy shifts in unanticipated ways, given how voice operates in Cambodia, potentially becoming a mouthpiece for the state. For instance, in 2017, I attended the Boston production of Cambodian Living Arts' show, Bongsikol, a Requiem for Cambodia. I had helped the production's organizers connect with Cambodian American musicians, and a couple of weeks after this performance, I caught up with a friend of mine who had performed in the event. I played drums in it. I asked him how the performance had gone, and he surprised me with a lengthy diatribe against Cambodian politicians and their mobilization of Khmer Rouge remembrance. He concluded, quote, "The only one who benefited from that show was Hun Sen," end quote. When public remembrance that keeps alive the memory of suffering also depicts possible future violence that the state claims it alone holds at bay, then an essential act of memory and performances aiming to break history's silence through a liberated voice, they can bolster an oppressive government. Remembrance and voice, which are so often taken as modes of political agency, justice, and healing, they function here as an unquiet revenant that serves the state and its most powerful politicians. That unintended effect is indicative of how public speech, music, performances, and rituals can all attain contradictory meanings and multiple efficacies, regardless of intentionality, when they cross from one political and ontological domain into another. The result is what one Cambodian friend of mine refers to as a vice. "You know a vice?" he asked me. That means when we feel a pressure that's applied by the politicians, that makes a vice, the vice of politics. And all those performances about the Khmer Rouge, they all connect with politics. Several years before I met this person, the Ministry of Culture in Cambodia offered him a job working as a ritualist. He declined the invitation, choosing not to add his voice to the vice of politics. If he had taken that job, he would have performed in shows promoting Hun Sen. He chose instead to continue teaching his neighbors and relatives and working on local rituals with them. That choice that he made exemplifies the politics of intimate voice, whereby people attempt to carve out a quiet enclave in which utterances do not reverberate for or against the state. The difference that my friend seeks to maintain, it's not sonic or gestural. The ritual sounds he utilizes in his local rituals, they are the same exact ones, the same exact ritual actions that are used in rituals that are sponsored by the Prime Minister, Hun Sen. But the difference that he seeks to carve out derives from the ethics of his ritual actions and the scale, the small scale of the collectivity involved. This resembles Dura Sam's statement that her mother doesn't talk with them, she talks with me. It resembles what ethnomusicologist Darcy Sprengel terms quiet politics, and Ray Chow's insistence that, quote, inarticulateness is a way of combating the talking function of the state, the most articulate organ that speaks for everyone. It resembles philosopher Isabel Sprenger's observation that the political arena is peopled with shadows of that which does not have a political voice, cannot have, or does not want to have one. Just as much what I have termed an intimate voice aligns with an aspect of Georg Zimmel's notion of secrecy. Secrecy, Zimmel writes, secures, so to speak, the possibility of a second world alongside the obvious world, and the latter is more strenuously affected by the former. In the politically charged context of genocide remembrance, those transactions between worlds present Cambodians with several ethical dilemmas, including how to care for the dead, how to generate well-being after violence, how to negotiate liberal discourses, and how to operate amid ongoing authoritarian governance. I have discussed how many Cambodians cope with these dilemmas through a quiet, guarded, and intimate voice. Still, as Sprenger's and Zimmel's thinking suggests, that move to invigorate a secret, shadowy, or intimate realm, it is not an abdication of public involvement, but a potentially vigorous means of affecting the obvious world. Any resulting feedback from one world into another and the long-term political ramifications that may result may be tenuous, contingent, and open-ended. Even so, refraining from speaking and acting amid a broad social collective and instead using an intimate voice to bolster intimate sociality may paradoxically be a powerful and long-standing political formation in Cambodia. Thank you very much.
Time for questions, and I'm going to let you have the floor to field those questions.
Yeah, great.
Feel free to raise your hands. Like I said, afterwards we'll have more informal opportunities to talk to Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff, for the talk. Fantastic. And I had a question to compare in a very different scenario. Colombia, where I grew up, was for 50 years, more 60 years, living a very low, sometimes high-intensity civil war. And the government did create a ministry of culture that was often referred to as the Ministry of Peace. Now, what I'm curious is if in Cambodia there's an equivalent branch of government that has been associated with this kind of being out of the genocide, like moving on peace, reconciliation, etc.
I'd say not officially like that. Something being labeled as the Ministry of Peace. There were strong efforts very soon after the genocide to get some this Benpiat music that's to get that going again. This stuff is played at Buddhist rituals that make offerings to spirits and ancestors and the dead, and perhaps that's my answer. Perhaps that might be this kind of unofficial mode of reconciliation and peace by using music to care for the dead and to make dedications to them. As far as, I think I'd have to be a little more cynical. Maybe your take is cynical as well. I don't know if that Ministry of Peace has worked in Colombia or what's come out of it, but I think a lot of people, whether they're involved with the Ministry of Culture, many musicians are, or they choose not to be, like my friend there, I think they kind of recognize that history and these narratives belong to the politicians and get it's their country, it's their history. So one person said to me. The other maybe complicating factor is, of course, Hun Sen being former Khmer Rouge himself. And so there has been a push coming from both Hun Sen and then the international community for this Khmer Rouge tribunal. And there wasn't as much of an effort to use kind of music per se as part of that peace and reconciliation effort that went along with this tribunal. There was a move to use testimony. And there was one of the productions, this show called Breaking the Silence. It's written by, I forget where she came from, a European playwright. So they toured with this production around the country. This was in the early 2000s, I think. I saw this show in 2010, and then they're still touring Cambodia with it. So there's an effort coming from the NGO sector to use that performance to go along with this kind of international movement toward peace and reconciliation, but much less coming from the government. Yeah, Kurt.
I was curious, first of all, amazing presentation, I really enjoyed it. I was curious, I mean, you were talking about Siem Reap quite a bit. where, I mean, it's just such a big tourist area that's building itself up. There's so much international involvement. I'm curious how you see, or if you see any of these kind of groups that you're discussing here with their different ontologies. Which one kind of, if any, plays like the prominent role in kind of performances for tourists, and kind of who is serving as that, I guess, voice for the people coming in and visiting?
Are you talking about just in general,
Yeah,
or
just-
in regard to Khmer Rouge stuff? Just in general?
Just in general. I mean, I
Yeah.
know there's plenty of Khmer Rouge stuff even
Yeah.
though.
Yeah, let's move on. I'd say several. So there was this organization called Savannah Pum that was based in Phnom Penh. They were doing shows in 2004, which was the first time that I visited Cambodia, marketing them mainly. These were shadow performances, marketing them for foreigners there. Kind of these folkloric productions they were doing. And then, I'd say by the mid-2010s, it's this NGO, Cambodian Living Arts, really has taken over as a powerful player. They're really sharp about working their connections actually with the government. So they have this series of performances that before COVID was going on at the National Museum in Phnom Penh. They've done a number of international tours with, again, all this folkloric stuff. And then more recently, when I went back for my dissertation fieldwork, they were getting challenged in some ways by this arts group PHARE, P-H-A-R-E, that I started the talk by mentioning their collaboration with Global Arts Corps, which is an interesting one, but they really focus on much traditional Cambodian circus arts, and using both traditional and just kind of contemporary forms of music, and they've been hugely successful marketing that in this great tent that they have on the outskirts of Siem Reap. So those are the main players, I think, that market this stuff for foreigners. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. It's all deeply disturbing and wonderfully interesting. And you show how dangerous it is to come with our, one culture's perception of notions and project that. So you gave us some voices, and some of your first interviewee was, I found that very disturbing, that a young person seemed to say, no, I don't really want to know about this, or that's not what she said, but
She said a couple of different things.
she said different things, and it to me that sounded very much, as someone from post-World War Europe, these are the denial phase people, and that's usually the kids who haven't been taught. And you say there is a horrible, there is a curriculum that does tackle that. So it's not that they don't learn, but so have you found voices from inside Cambodia sort of tackling this and saying, hello, world interpretive community, you're getting this wrong, this is how we see it?
That's interesting. There's a lot of what I wanted to respond to, besides when you got to your question at the end. I'm not sure. I'll start with your question, and then I have a few kind of comments on what led up to it. So, in my experience, so I can't speak for everybody. I haven't noticed many Cambodians coming out and saying this, that you've got this wrong. Most of them, I think, just care about, it's less important. They just want to go about their business, caring for their dead and moving on. And that's kind of what I've noticed. a number of them do get, it gets very, very tricky. So of course there's Cambodians who perform in these productions, who choose to perform in them. And a number of them articulated more positive interpretations. There's this one guy, the arts executive director of FAR. He's told me, I asked him, he had many negative things. He was very critical about the show his organization did. So I asked him, I was like, what do you think, who benefits from this show? And his answer was interesting. He just said humanity. Humanity benefits from this. And then there was another person who played in Bangsko, that production. He's another friend of mine, and he gave a somewhat different response. He said, we're doing this not just to kind of care for our own dead, but we want to give other people the opportunity to care for their own dead, the people around the world to do what we do. So this gets complicated, I think, because here you have musicians' emotional labor, their musical labor that's being mobilized for people who are not them, the direct beneficiaries of their labor. It's not Cambodians, it's meant for foreigners, and they very much recognize that. So I don't know, but nobody necessarily comes out and says, you've got it wrong, everybody. Yeah, I don't care. Yeah, Olideli, fantastic.
Hello, Jeff. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I think I found it very interesting because, first of all, your work speaks to something around memory studies, which I find very interesting. But in post-conflict area or states like South Africa, Liberia, Nigeria, there are discourse, around this kind of ways, the politics of silence and memory. For instance, when you look at the works of Adichie Chimamanda Adichie, she's more, taking that discourse to a new level. Even the generation before her, Wole Soyinka, Achebe. So in the Nigerian context, let's start with that. The politics resonated more within literature. People are not allowed, up to today in Nigeria, people are now allowed to talk publicly about Biafra, for instance, which was a genocide also. But artistic voices beyond the music scene started writing about it, but encoding music voice in literature, in dramatic, stage work, which then becomes the archive of memory, where people started learning about Biafra genocide. The same thing in the case of Liberia. There are layers of literature, and the same place, even in South Africa, in fact, they even put in place community for reconciliation panel, and but despite that, there are things that were not allowed to be expressed directly. But artistic voices across the community, literary scholars have been writing about things that couldn't be voiced out, and people are learning about it. In the Cambodian context, how has the artistic voice beyond music, shaped the artistic voices, responded? How are they responding to the state politics of silence in Cambodia?
How are the musicians, the music?
Not musicians. Musicians are not always in this post-conflict period. Musicians hardly come out because they are afraid. But the literary arena, for instance, in the African context, are very, very strong. All the memories are documented in the works of the likes of Wole Soyinka, Adichie. In South Africa also, there are works, but are there literary movements that are documenting this memory in artistic work, documenting all these things?
So, I don't know if I have a direct answer for your question. One thing I'll note is to kind of compare it with one perhaps specific African context. Nomi Dave, the ethnomusicologist, has written about Guinea and the politics of silence in Guinea. And one thing she says in an article in a book of hers that I think is very interesting is that musicians in Guinea were went by this kind of culture of silence. They didn't, when there was this political violence, they didn't come up with protest songs. But you found those protest songs in the Ghanaian diaspora. And so you have a very similar dynamic that is present in Cambodian literary people. So whereas in Cambodia, there's not that many, there's a few memoirs that people who have survived the main detention center, S21, Tuol Sleng. There's just a handful of people who have died, who have survived that. And I think 2 of them, Cambodians, now have written memoirs about their experiences. That's all that I know of coming out of Cambodia. But you find tons and tons of these memoirs coming out of Cambodians living in diaspora communities. And so then I just wanted to kind of piggyback on one thing that you said, which is kind of saying that coming from these literary memoirs or whatever, grapplings with this in that African context, you kind of get this archive of memory that develops. If you want to look for an archive of memory in Cambodia, go here.
Exactly.
This is where you find it. This is what I argue is this local embodied remembrance, embodied history, where you have the memory of suffering and genocide comes through rituals, through music performances. It's not the literary people who hold this archive. It's through these rituals and performances. Yeah, Julianne, I'd love to hear.
Yes, thank you. So I'm just curious, in your theorizing of all this great detailed ethnographic content, if you have thought about this through the lens of kind of the continued experience of generational trauma, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, certainly in popular discourse in the U.S., we talk about trauma as not just a thing that happened and now it's over, but something that people continue to live over and over throughout their lives, particularly in light of triggering events, which I would assume that some of these performances would be for people who live through those things. So I was just curious if you ever considered kind of interpreting some of those statements by the younger generation of resistance, kind of in light of maybe some continued symbolic and real violences that might be happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I didn't really dig into like trauma that much here. I do more in writing. So a couple of things. What was I thinking of? Yes. I think you could interpret through the lens of trauma. You can interpret not just what kind of the younger generation is saying, kind of those quotes that I put up there. You also could interpret some of those stories I shared about food. People are talking about, you know, this thing that a ritual brings this up, and you say, you know, oh, life is suffering, life is hard. Like this could be interpreted as continued trauma. Or could you interpret that as a Buddhist worldview? Could you interpret that as this Buddhist worldview that emphasizes suffering, that emphasizes life is just by default difficult, and we need to cope with that? So my answer is that you can interpret it that way, but is that accurate? So like for trauma, you know, you have in Cambodia, of course, when people, psychiatrists, I'm not a clinician, and I'm kind of careful. I try to be careful talking about this, but you know, there's the American Psychological Association's diagnostic statistical manual. They have this list of check boxes that you can go in, these symptoms of trauma. And this is reductive, I know, but if you know enough of the boxes get checked, then you can say this person suffers from PTSD. Well, what happens if those things that are, in one understanding, evidence of trauma, what happens if in another understanding they are just positive ways of coping? You might have this pathologization of healthy coping mechanisms. And then that even becomes the case. So there's been a number of psychiatrists, one Cambodian psychiatrist, and then a couple out of Harvard who've come up with this thing called local idioms of distress. So they attempt at least to have this culturally situated understanding of mental well-being or mental illnesses. But there's been a number of studies that have found that, so like, you know, in case you're not talking about trauma, you're talking about gut chardan, which is this Cambodian thing that says thinking too much, right? But even then, are you pathologizing these healthy adaptive behaviors? And then some researchers found that even when you substitute these kind of local idioms of distress, they end up being stand-ins for Western understandings of trauma. Yeah, so it becomes very, very difficult. Yeah, so
great. I love this work you're doing. It's wonderful. I have actually a comment and a follow-up question.
yeah.
I think that your answer to that question really kind of makes sense because you are problematizing the discourses of healing. So of course you're going to have to problematize Western notions about trauma and how generational trauma works. And it makes a lot of sense. So I think the big difference, and you're pointing us to this all the time, is that the dead are not an afterthought, right? That there are the dead's afterlives are entangled with the community's afterlives. And so what trauma may mean in terms of this idea of loss changes because the dead can come and speak and communicate and are still active in the community's lives. So I don't know, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the afterlives of these ancestors that come back and how they affect maybe the idea or the way that people understand the intimate voices and kind of expressing how they're continuing to live. I mean, it's not you have a different idea of the afterlife, so your idea of what the effects of trauma are going to have to be different, right? So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
That's fantastic. Thank you. These questions are all really, really good. Thank you for the invitations to keep speaking. Let's see. So this actually goes towards kind of the broader project that I'm up to very much, which I struggled with where to position the Khmer Rouge in that.
Sure.
Broader, and my choice actually was to kind of to put this at the end, and up until that point, kind of get at the Khmer Rouge sideways. And part of the argument is, or what I tried to do, is to show the many different ways through sound and music that people are bringing these beings back into their lives, and they're feeling them on their bodies as co-presences, as things that bring strength. Many of them say that their capacities of musicians are heightened because their dead parents, who were their teachers, are like sitting with them on their shoulders, right? So that's kind of where the bulk of the project goes, is the many ways people do this. But one way to circle back to your kind of question about trauma is where this lands is a very different interpretation of personhood.
Exactly.
So there is not this autonomous individual, which trauma kind of programs presume that the goal is to go back to reconstituting this healthy subject. What if the self doesn't exist in Buddhism? What if what maybe does exist provisionally is this conglomeration of many? There's individual personhood from Strather, and that's at play here, and then you also have all these beings and entities from the earth who come and form who you are. So there's a very different idea of personhood, this holistic idea of personhood, whereas the trauma paradigm says it's a very much walled off, closed off thing. So they're very, very different.
And it's not even human, right? It would include more than
yes,
human, right?
yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I don't quite engage. Maybe I should engage more with post-humanist scholarship, but it's more than humans.
And as Jeff has just invited all of us to continue these questions, I invite all of us to continue these questions someday. So let's give Jeff a round of
It's about
applause.
time. Thank you.
We're going to be up next on the second floor.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna, before I forget, with my stuff. Enjoy your I mean, I would love that.
I was going to disassemble it, and can I keep it in your office? Okay. Kayla asked if I can keep it in your office.